am super excited to have you on, Peter. And I told this before, and I'm really excited to be able to say this to you in person. But not just one, but two of the most important intellectual moments of my life were kind of created by you. Famine, Affluence, and Morality, the very famous paper you wrote in Philosophy of Public Affairs. And then obviously Animal Liberation, which I think everybody in this universe, in the kind of my audience, knows about. But you've taught so many people over the years. You just retired from Princeton University. So I thought I'd start the podcast with the question of who's taught you the most over the 50 years? Is it 50 years you've been teaching students? Over the years, have you been taught by someone that has had a huge impact on you?
There are a lot of people who've had an impact on me. Going back, I suppose, to the first teacher I had in ethics when I was an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne, who I really don't agree with anything very much he said, but he did tell me about utilitarianism. He actually introduced us to the best book on utilitarianism, which is not John Stuart Mill's more famous short essay, Utilitarianism, but a much larger book by Henry Sidgwick, a late 19th century utilitarian. So that was important that, we got introduced to it. And when I wrote an essay supporting it, although he was not a utilitarian, he was fair enough to assess the essay well and encouraged me to go on with more philosophy. I got to Oxford and I was taught by R.M. Hare, who was the professor of moral philosophy then. And I also learned a lot from him. Particularly relevant to your audience, I more or less by accident met a Canadian graduate student called Richard Keshen, who was the first vegetarian who I'd ever met and had a conversation with about why he was a vegetarian. I learned from him that my illusions about animals having good lives out in the fields were not corresponding to the reality, because they were already, this is 1970, they were already indoors, a lot of them, chickens and pigs in factory farms where whatever could be done to produce their flesh more cheaply or their eggs more cheaply would be done. So that was really important, something that I learned. And it goes on from there, I guess. I've always been learning from not so much teachers anymore after that point, but colleagues, philosophers like Derek Parford at Oxford, most recently by my friend and colleague Kasia de Lazari-Radek, with whom I'm currently doing a podcast called Lives Well Lived. And we did a book together, actually about Sidgwick, the philosopher I just mentioned, called The Point of View of the Universe. So, I think by working together with people, you very often learn a lot of things.
Yeah, I think honestly the best ideas I've had have been collective ideas based on some sort of back and forth with someone. Who was that professor at Melbourne who introduced you to moral philosophy and utilitarianism? And why did you disagree with him? He had such a big impact on you, changed the course of your life. And yet you said, the first thing you said about him is, and I didn't agree with him on anything except utilitarianism. So.
Well, we didn't agree on utilitarianism. He was a critic of it.
So he was not a utilitarian. He just introduced you to it.
Yeah, okay. He was just, a good teacher who said, I want to introduce students to the best versions of all of the major ethical theories, even though I think, all but one of those theories is wrong. He was a kind of intuitionist who thought that we have certain duties that we could intuit, including duties of, honesty and gratitude, benevolence, which comes close to utilitarianism, but for him it was only one duty among others. So we argued about that, but as I say, he didn't object to the fact that I didn't accept his arguments. His name was John McCloskey, by the way. I should mention he's no longer around, unfortunately. But he was and the other important thing about him was that this was a time when philosophers were mostly engaged in analyzing the meanings of the words, moral language or other language. It was an era known as linguistic analysis or linguistic philosophy, sometimes called ordinary language philosophy, which really was pretty boring and not very, not very significant. But he was old-fashioned enough to stick to the old idea that philosophy had something to tell us about what's right and wrong and how we ought to live. And for that, some of his colleagues, I guess behind his back, sort of, thought that he was really an old-fashioned stick in the mud who hadn't got with the new game in town. But actually, the new game in town was a passing fad, fortunately, and philosophy got back to its long-term tradition of, goes back to Socrates, of saying we need to talk about how we ought to live, and that's what he was doing.
Did you stay in touch with him over the years? And
yes,
did you
I stayed in touch with him.
Continue the discussion about utilitarianism?
We continued the discussion about many things, in fact, and to some extent, unfortunately, disagreements got a little bit sharper, because I was, after doing my undergraduate degree, and I did a master's degree under John McCloskey's supervision, but then I went to Oxford, then I spent a couple of years teaching in Oxford, then I taught at New York, then I came back to Australia, but by then I had was writing Animal Liberation, or I'd written it and came out, and he didn't agree with that, and then I got into bioethics, and I supported reforms that we now have in Australia, and you certainly have in California, about medically assisted dying. He didn't agree with that. So our disagreements actually became sharper. And although we were, still somewhat friendly, I think in the last few years of his life, we were certainly not as close as we had been before.
Yeah, I think I don't know if this is what happened with you and John McCloskey, but the world has changed in this strange way where philosophical and intellectual disagreements often lead to personal disagreements in a way that is very unpleasant for all of us. And I wish we could have more thoughtful conversations and debates without having it interfere with the personal relationships we've had. One of the reasons I love the University of Chicago, I was affiliated with 3 different institutions over my very short and not nearly as illustrious career as yours, but University of Chicago, MIT, and Northwestern, all of which were great institutions. But the place that what really captured my heart was Chicago, partly because there were just ridiculously absurd and intense debates happening all the time. And it was very much welcome. And that's one of the things that really appeals to me about your work. You've always been willing to have sharp disagreements while being very respectful to the people you're disagreeing with. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Why was he against animal liberation?
Why was he against animal liberation? Oh, it was sort of, animals don't have rights. They're not the kinds of beings who can have rights. He wasn't, he didn't think it was okay to be cruel to animals, but he was like many people who thought, well, they don't have rights that prevent us eating them. And I think he acknowledged that factory farming was not good, but I don't think he actually ever made the effort of avoiding factory farmed products.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's jump into one of the big things that's come out for you over the last year, which is the publication. Or is it the last year? It's about a year, right? Since Animal Liberation Now came out?
Yes, it's almost exactly a year.
Yeah. So you published a book, Animal Liberation, that we've already talked about, in 1975. And it changed my life. And honestly, it was almost the first sentence changed my life. And certainly the first chapter, because the first sentence just struck me like a bolt of lightning. I just couldn't believe kind of the implications of the sentence. And I don't know if you remember the first sentence of the first edition of Animal Liberation.
You have to quote it to me.
The first sentence was, "This is a book about the tyranny of human over non-human animals." And then you go in to defend that description. And I love the fact that in the most recent edition, you used the word tyranny again in the conclusion. I don't know if you did this intentionally, but it almost feels like it's coming back to the beginnings in 1975. And I think that term was important, not just because it indicated there was something wrong morally about what was happening to animals, but the degree and severity of that wrong, right? And I think there are a lot of things that are not going right for animals, for sure. And you talk about those in Animal Liberation Now. One thing that is going right for animals, and that's shown even by the preface of the newest edition of Animal Liberation, which is written by Yuval Noah Harari, is that serious people across the world now consider animal liberation and animal rights one of the most important moral issues in the planet's history. And I say that without exaggeration. I think in all my times in kind of higher education, all the discussions I've had with the most thoughtful journalists in the country, including both people on the right and the left, there are people like Ezra Klein, obviously, who've been very supportive of animal liberation. But a lot of people don't know that Charles Krautheimer, the kind of a neocon conservative journalist for the Washington Post. Near the end of his career, he said, the one thing that I think our ancestors will judge us on is the way we treat animals. Sometimes I think about eating a burger and I wonder if my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren might be ashamed of what I did. So I guess I want to dive into this book and what you've learned over the last, oh my gosh, it's 50 years, Peter. That's wild. 50 years. But before,
it's 49 years since Animal Liberation was published. Yeah, but close to 50.
But before I even go there, can I start with a more introductory question, which I think a lot of people who are familiar with animal rights have some intuitions about animals, probably haven't thought much about, but I think is an important intellectual question, which is, why do we even believe there are right answers to morality? What have you learned over the last 49 years about how to convince people that there are right and wrong answers about morality in the first place? Because I think with the decline of religion, especially, I'm seeing an increasing number of people who just have a completely relativistic view of morality and say, morality is just basically whatever the social norm is. There's no intrinsically right or wrong answer.
Well, I think that view, that morality is whatever the social norm is not really one that many people hold when you push them just a little bit, right? So you can say to them, for example, assume we're talking to Americans, you can say, so does that mean that it was right for people in Mississippi to own slaves, for white people in Mississippi to own slaves in 1820 or whenever it might have been? And not many people will go along with that, I think. And, you can go further. Does that mean that it was right for the Nazis to murder Jews and Roma people in 1944? Because that was the local culture then, or at least seemed to be. I think it's very hard for people just to say yes to that. I'm not saying that this is a knockdown refutation. They can say, well, yes, that was right for them. Of course, I hate it because I'm not in that culture, but it was the right for them. But that's very contrary to everything that we're doing, including, they're not really alive anymore, but including punishing the people who were carrying out the Holocaust. Why would be punishing them if what they were doing was right at the time? That seems a little harsh. So I think you can fairly easily move people away from this quite shallow cultural relativism. It's harder to deal with a real skeptic who just says, well, morality is whatever I think, whatever I like, that's my view, and you have your view, and all views are equally true or false, or not capable of being true or false, really. With that, I would argue there are some things that are self-evident that we can't really deny if we think about them carefully. Some of them are more, and this again goes back to Sidgwick, some of them are more formal claims. He called them axioms. Like, if I say that something is right for me to do, then I have to imply that it's right for you to do if you're in my circumstances and I were in your circumstances. So this again is something that I got from Hare as well. If somebody says, well, it's right for me to enslave you because I'm white and you're black, and then that implies that if it should so happen that you are black and I'm white, sorry, I got that the wrong way around. That you are white and I'm black, it would be right for you to enslave me. And I think that's a pretty basic principle that we can see, that you can't, if you're talking ethically, you can't have judgments that are just about yourself, that make an exception for yourself, unless there's some other relevant circumstances. Of course, you can argue, well, I'm much wiser than you, and so I will know what's better for you, and I'm benevolent, so I will look after your interests. That's a different claim, and then it gets to a factual claim as to whether I am really wiser than you and whether I will really look after your interests, which, of course, if we're talking about slavery still, was just not the case. So that's the sort of formal axioms, or one of them. The other thing, I think, is the content of those axioms. And if you think about some time in which you're in agony, you're experiencing prolonged agony, I I think we all see that as a bad thing. We see that as something that we want to stop, we want to get out of, and we would thank anybody who prevented us being in agony, and we would condemn anybody who inflicted that agony on us, let's say, for the fun of it, because they were sadistic. So that gives us some content that at least extreme prolonged suffering is a bad thing. And again, combining it with that other axiom, that means if it's a bad thing for me, it's a bad thing for you. And the you, this is getting more into a topic of animals, the you should not depend on race or sex. And as I argued in Animal Liberation, it shouldn't depend on species either. So if we're inflicting prolonged agony on any being capable of experiencing agony, then that's a bad thing. Now, that in itself is not enough to say it's always wrong. It just says that it is sort of prima facie bad, and there has to be a sufficient justification for it. So there could be a sufficient justification for it. That's something that you then need to debate. But the case needs to be made that it is justified. So those are sort of, if you like, some of the most basic ethical claims. That's not the totality of it that I would make. And I don't think those claims are either culturally relative or subjective. I just think they are true.
So in what sense are they true? To someone who is a deep skeptic about the nature of true and false moral claims, if someone says, yeah, I concede that it's inconsistent for me to say it's okay for me to enslave you, but it's not okay for you to enslave me, that doesn't mean it's true or false, that it's wrong to enslave. It just means I'm inconsistent. How do you make the jump to saying this is a true proposition in the same way that we can say this is a laptop computer that I'm doing a live stream or a podcast with Peter Singer with? That can be verified empirically. We can state that there's evidence out there in the world showing that this proposition is true. There's something different about moral propositions that I think makes it sometimes difficult for people to agree with. Not that empirical or factual propositions are not contested heatedly all over the world, but moral propositions are sometimes harder to convince people of.
Yes, they're harder because they're not factual propositions, and factual propositions we can provide evidence for. As you say, even there's always the skeptics. I might be dreaming. This might be a simulation that someone has rigged up. There's no laptop in front of me. It just looks like there's a laptop in front of me. But I think we can investigate that. We can produce evidence for it, for that we're not dreaming. We can find other observers who agree to it, and so on. In the case of moral truths, they're not descriptive truths about the world. They're normative truths, and they're not facts about the natural world that scientists can tell us about in research. I see them as non-natural normative truths. Now, you might say, well, is this a unique kind of truth? To some extent, but I think mathematical truths are also non-natural truths. We don't observe them by accumulating evidence. We don't. It's not like we look at objects and we take one object and we put it next to a second object and then we add it up and say, now we have two objects, and we keep doing that, and that's how we know that 1 and 1 makes 2. There's something else going on here. And logical truths, I think the idea that, if all A are B and all B are C, then all A are C, that's a non-natural logical truth, and there's a whole set of those logical truths. So I think that in some way these moral truths are like them, but not in all ways, because, as I say, they're normative. Maybe the others are normative in the sense that, if you're going to be capable of reasoning, you have to accept these laws of logic. If you're going to, you would accept laws of mathematics as well. So there's some parallel, but I agree that this is different. But I'd still claim it's an objective truth, and that even if people came from another galaxy, and as long as they were rational beings, and they were capable of experiencing pain or agony, they would agree with us that these were bad things.
Yeah, I think the comparison to mathematics is pretty interesting, compelling, because there are certain principles of mathematics that just help us logically understand the world around us, and they don't have an empirical grounding in reality necessarily. I mean, they help us navigate reality because they're based on logically sound propositions. Like 1 + 1 = 2 is a logically sound proposition that helps us navigate the world around us. But there's no factual basis for that truth. It's two concepts, 1 and 1 = 2, that are just seemingly axiomatic truths about the nature of the universe. And I think the same is true of morality. I think one of the most important concepts for me that I learned through you is this concept from R.M. Hare. I think it's from Hare, of the interchangeability of perspectives. The idea that to the extent you're going to make a moral claim, it's kind of what you were saying, that it shouldn't matter who's making the claim. The claim should be valid, and it shouldn't depend on whether it's a black person, a white person, someone who's gay, straight, woman, man, dog, or cat. And that was incredibly compelling to me. And one thing that's interesting, that I think you observed this in The Expanding Circle, which is a book you wrote probably 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. I don't even know. When did you write The Expanding
Oh,
Circle?
more
40
actually.
years ago?
The first edition of the Expanding Circle came out in
Okay.
1981, so we're
Yeah,
up to
beautiful book, very powerful book. But I think you
you.
make the observation, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it's in this book, that you see many different moral traditions around the world kind of converging towards something like the golden rule, or the interchangeability of perspectives, the notion that you really can't treat someone differently arbitrarily just because of some insignificant difference in what their capacities are, who they are, or what their status is. And that has been kind of one of the rules of the evolution of certainly human civilization over the last few hundred years, if you believe what Steven Pinker wrote, which I do. I think Steven Pinker is right that over time we have become a less violent species and more willing to, at least within the human species, be kind to people who are different than us. What do you think of Steven Pinker's argument? Do you think over time human beings have become more compassionate and moral?
I think if you take a long enough perspective, yes, that's true. And you're right. That is part of what I was arguing in The Expanding Circle, although, as the title of that suggests, I was actually particularly focused on pushing at the boundaries of those for whom we have moral concern, and noting the way that had grown over millennia from a small tribal ethic to an ethic that embraced perhaps initially a larger society, a larger group, then an entire race, and then with something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, officially took in the whole of our species, excuse me, as granting human rights to every member of our species, but now is pushing beyond the boundary of that as well, and including non-human animals. So that I think goes along with Steven Pinker's point. In fact, in The Better Angels of Nature, he refers to the Expanding Circle and to that view and endorses it. But he produced a lot more research and a lot more evidence of this continuing, and, as you say, of the decline in violence in societies. It's perhaps a little harder to run the really optimistic line now than it was, let's say, in 2000, when the world seemed to be moving away from wars, or at least large-scale wars among the leading industrialized countries were very much on the decline after the Second World War. Not that they didn't exist at all, but they were far fewer. But since 9/11, I guess there's been more violence inflicted on countries in a variety of ways, through terrorism and through countries responding to that terrorism by going to war, as the United States did in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And now, of course, we have wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, in Gaza. So it's not a steady progress. It's a bit more like the way the stock market goes. It rises and then it falls, but the overall trend is still upward. And I'm hopeful, though we don't have enough perspective on it, that that's the same here too, and that maybe in another 20 years these wars will be over and we'll be again back to that improving line of reducing violence globally.
I'm actually a little surprised you use the examples of Ukraine and Gaza, because I would have thought that the source of your pessimism is animals, based on Animal Liberation Now. Because Animal Liberation Now, I think it's a brilliant
I
book.
use
The
those
one part
examples.
of it that I wasn't, one part of it I wasn't so happy about was it's a surprisingly pessimistic book. You sound almost kind of defeated at points in the book about the status of the animal rights movement. And Steven Pinker himself, to his credit, he acknowledges that one of the primary counterarguments to his thesis that the world is becoming a kinder, more compassionate place is factory farms. And he points out, well, we're a lot nicer to each other and to animals. The exception is factory farming, and in particular, the broiler chicken. If you look at the number of these animals that are being tortured around the world, this is kind of a counterpoint. So,
that's true.
So say more about that.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me just say, but although he says that about factory farming, he was more positive about progress in reducing animal suffering in science. He talks about this incident when he was a graduate student, where on the instructions of his professor, he essentially tortured a rat to death, not intentionally, but that's how it worked out. But then he says something like, but this has all changed. We now have institutional animal review committees, and the difference is like night and day. Unfortunately, when I went back to researching experiments done on animals for Animal Liberation Now, I found plenty of night. It was not all daylight. So there are still a lot of nasty things done to animals in laboratories. I think Stephen was too optimistic about that. But my responses about Ukraine and Gaza were really related to this, what I've been saying about wars and violence among humans.
Human beings, yeah.
And you're right. As far, I am somewhat pessimistic in Animal Liberation Now, because it's disappointing that nearly 50 years after the book appeared, and many people like you, fortunately, have been influenced by it, but the result has not been that there are fewer animals suffering in factory farms than there were in 1975. Just the reverse. There are more animals suffering. Now, there's explanations for that, in particular, the fact that China is more prosperous, and China is now a major factory farmer of animals, where it was too poor to do that before. People couldn't afford meat or animal products. So that's an important factor that, in a way, is oblique to questions of our attitudes to animals. But even in countries like the United States, and despite the rise in the number of vegans and vegetarians and the greater consciousness of animal suffering, and as you say, the opinion leaders like Krauthammer or Harari, who clearly think that what we're doing is wrong, there are still more animals in factory farms in the United States now than there were 50 years ago too. And so that's a very depressing figure. And if there's a somewhat depressed view expressed in Animal Liberation Now, that's why. But I actually think that I am still hopeful that we will continue to make progress, that attitudes are much better than they were. And I'm not truly a pessimist about making progress. If I were, I wouldn't have written that book.
Yeah, and see, this is the one point of disagreement, I think, or at least the one major point of disagreement that I had with you on Animal Liberation Now, because I don't think we should just be hopeful. I think we should be confident, and I can say why if you're interested.
Okay,
because to me, so many of the markers. Okay, so here's an example. By the way, I just want to note and put a pin on the idea that China is a huge problem. I don't know if you've been to China recently, but I've seen some of the new factory farms in China, and I've been to China to try and train activists to do undercover investigations. First, it's extremely difficult to do any sort of activism in China. I don't think you realize how nice it is to have basic civil liberties until you're in a country that lacks any of them. It's terrifying to do activism. But secondly, the scale of these facilities, which you write about in the book, Animal Liberation Now, is terrifying. But the main reason for my optimism is because I'm not primarily interested in economic markers or short-term markers of animal suffering. I think in the long term, we should care obviously about animal suffering, because I'm with you, and that I'm a utilitarian, I'm a consequentialist. We should measure the results of our work by how many living beings are suffering, how many of them are living lives that are worth living. And in the short term, those numbers have gone in the wrong direction. But I think there are 2 points I'd make. One is the counterfactual. Where would the world be without the animal rights movement? And I think it'd be much, much worse. I think if not for your book in 1975, the work that you and Ingrid Newkirk and so many other people have done over the last 40 years, the world would be a much worse place. But second is, I don't think the economic indicators are necessarily the most important indicators in predicting future progress. I think the political indicators are much more important. And I'll give you one concrete example. If you look at mink sales in the United States and other sales of fur-bearing animals, and right up until 2016, 2017, the graph is going up and up and up. I think in 2016, the year before we passed the ban on fur in Berkeley, the number had increased by like about 200, 300,000 to 3.8 million minks slaughtered and sold in the United States. And right after that, despite basically 20 years of continued increase, it falls off a cliff. And why is that? Because a political movement was able to ban fur in Berkeley, San Francisco, and California, and that set off a cascade of all the major brands and designers across the world basically saying, okay, the social norm has changed. I guess we can't sell fur anymore. And now it's fallen off a cliff where fur production has decreased. One of the reasons I think Norway and some of these countries were willing to basically at least temporarily outright ban fur during COVID-19 when there were outbreaks of COVID-19 in mink farms is because they saw the writing was on the wall. The fur industry was disappearing. So I think in many cases, the economic indicators are a lagging indicator. I'll give you one other example, and that is the anti-slavery movement. If you look at the data on slavery in the United States between 1850 and 1860, I think the numbers are slavery increased in that decade, right before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, by about 33%, massive increase. It was becoming a much more productive industry. I think it went from about 3 million slaves to 4 million slaves in that 10-year time period. And it was economically a very productive industry. Robert Fogel, a Nobel Prize winner at the University of Chicago, did the best analysis of this and showed that slavery was incredibly profitable, even with the shift towards manufacturing, because a lot of the manufacturing in the North was driven by basically slave products in the South, cotton and tobacco. The cotton gin was an incredibly important innovation that actually made slaves more profitable because cotton became a much more valuable crop. And I guess my last point is, if you're not concerned as much about economic indicators, you're looking at political indicators. I mean, in the preface of your book, you write about all the massive political achievements the animal rights movement has made, even in the last 10 years. And to me, those are signs of immense progress. So for me, I feel like I believe in your theory and the expanding circle more than you do. I just think it is logically inevitable. I think the first chapter of Animal Liberation is still the best thing I've ever read in moral philosophy. It is just such a logically sound argument. And I think you're right that when people read that book, and not enough people have read it, more people should read it, they agree with the legitimacy of the argument. The problem is human beings descriptively don't rely on rationality. They do rely on social norms. And until we get to the point we have a critical mass of political activists who are able to shift the social norm, people will ignore their own eyes. They'll ignore their own moral intuitions, their own moral logic, and just do what everyone else is doing until we can flip things. And I think the political movement in the United States and around the world, in many ways, Australia is leading this, is getting to the point where we're going to flip that social norm. So I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah, that's nice. I hope that's true. I'm actually just taking
you
up the
say
last
nice,
remark.
and I think the word you meant was naive. That's the sense I got from your tone of voice.
It's a hopeful thing to say, and it's good to have hope. It's really important to have hope. So I agree with that. I'm a bit surprised that you think Australia is leading in animals. I'm not sure why you're saying that, because I'm speaking to you from Australia now, and I don't see it. I mean, the Australian government has said it will phase out laying cages for hens by 2036. The European Union did this in 2011, I think. So why does Australia have to take 25 years more than Spain, say? We don't think of Spain as a wonderful country for animals, because when somebody says Spain animals, you immediately think of bullfights, so you think they're barbaric, but actually they're way ahead of Australia in protecting animals, because yes, there may be a few hundred bulls who suffer, or perhaps even a few thousand, but there's many tens of millions of hens suffering in battery cages in Australia. So I'd rather, if I were to be a random animal in either Spain or Australia, I'd much rather be reincarnated as a random animal in Spain. My life would be likely to be better, given the chances that I would be a chicken rather than a bull. So I don't see that we're doing that well in Australia. But if you think we are, great. Tell me why.
Yeah, I mean, partly because I'm looking at political metrics and activism metrics more than kind of economic or even short-term suffering metrics. And there's something interesting about Australia in terms of the animal rights movement. It's not just you. You look at kind of Christelle Force or Patty Mark or even kind of Joey Carbstrong, James Aspey, some of the more modern YouTube influencers who have made such immense progress. I think the protests in Australia after Dominion was released, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Dominion, but it's an incredibly powerful documentary. Chris Delforce, who's just one of the greatest investigators of animal cruelty and animal rights history, spent 5 years, I think, documenting all the factory farms in Australia and did, I think, the most modern and relevant update on earthlings that has been done in any country. And I believe some of the mobilizations involved like tens of thousands of people on the streets. It was really, really powerful. And I haven't quite figured out why it is that Australia seems to be creating so many of the leading animal rights activists. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the population of Australia, I think, is quite small. It's like smaller than the population of California, right? I think it's like 25 million people, something like that.
25 million, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
25
right.
million. And the number of prominent animal rights activists your country has created over the last 40 years is kind of shocking to me.
Well, that's good, but
so I mean that's part of the reason.
We don't have the laws that California has. We don't have citizens-initiated referendum. Maybe we'd get them if we did. But we don't have the laws that you have to allow all farmed animals to be able to move and turn around and stretch their limbs without bumping into another animal in their cage or enclosure. So California is way ahead of us, despite all of these animal activists. And despite we have actually a couple of, only in state parliaments, not in federal parliament, we have a couple of members of the Animal Justice Party, which is very good. So it's interesting. I mean, what we're saying here is how are we measuring how well we're doing? And you're saying we're measuring it by the level of political activism, and I'm saying we measure it by the number of animals who are suffering unnecessarily, especially in factory farms, because that dominates the numbers. And there are different ways of measuring, and I think we can each have our reasons for being cheerful or pessimistic, depending on which ones we're looking at.
Yeah. And for the record, I mean, at the end of the day, you're right that the terminal objective of the animal rights movement is to help animals, not to help a movement. We don't care about the movement except to the extent it's able to help animals. And if the Australian movement, no matter how powerful it is, can't help out animals, who cares? Right?
Right.
Just because you're getting a lot of videos that go viral on social media, and a lot of people know him, James Aspey's name or Joey Carbstrong's name or, Durand, or who all these people are. But there is something pretty striking about the number of very prominent vegan activists who've come from Australia. And I haven't quite figured out why that's the case. But it didn't end in 1975. I think 1975 was the beginning of something interesting in Australia that I wish I could replicate around the world. So we talked about Prop 12 and Prop 2 in California. I wonder what your thoughts are about these animal welfare improvements over the last 20 or so years, because, Prop 2 was passed in California in 2008, which was at the time probably, I think you described it in, I think it was in Time or Newsweek as the most important animal welfare law in history. And we saw a lot of non-enforcement of the law. It got updated in 2018 to become Prop 12. We won a very important victory in the Supreme Court just last year, vindicating the right of Californians to protect animals from this horrific cruelty in the face of very significant constitutional challenge by the pork industry. Animal welfare and animal rights is not as big of a debate as it used to be, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or if you've kind of learned anything about the animal welfare versus animal rights debate over the last 20 years as a result of the fights we've had over cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and so on.
Oh, I think there's no evidence. Let's just restate the debate for those not familiar with it. The claim has been that we don't want. I think Tom Regan said this famously. We don't want larger cages. We want empty cages. And of course, that is true. If what we're talking about is the ultimate goal. We want empty cages. But the question is, will getting larger cages mean that we don't get empty cages? And I think it's now clear that that is not the case, that the movement to have larger cages actually advances the cause closer to getting empty cages. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is the those campaigns for the referendum, the propositions, enlightened a lot of people about how animals are treated. And secondly, the requirements that then came into effect do somewhat increase the prices of the animal products. Obviously, that's why in states where you don't have the possibility of these referenda, then those products are being made by standard factory farm methods, and that's why the pork producers sued the state of California to try to strike down these rules and say California can't prevent the import of pork products from other states, because they wanted to send those cheaper pork products into California, and that, of course, would have undermined the entire impact of those laws, because the point of the Californian laws is not simply that we don't want these horrible systems of farming in California. We also don't want animals to experience them. And if the animals simply experience them in Iowa or Nebraska rather than in California, there's no advantage. But because the Supreme Court, in one of its very few decisions in this current conservative court that I applaud, upheld California's right to determine what products should be sold within California as far as cruelty to animals is concerned, and incidentally also said that cruelty to animals is a significant public concern that gives them a reason for acting. So the pork producers lost that case, and I think that will make it easier for alternative products to compete with pork, and in that sense also we will reduce the amount of animal suffering, and we will get closer to empty cages, because once people move away from those industries, there's no reason for them. So in terms of this debate about is it abolition or reform that we want, that's a misstatement of the issue. Obviously, we all want abolition, or everybody in the movement ultimately wants abolition of these systems of rearing animals. But the question is simply how we get there. And the states that have not had Proposition 2 or 12 or similar laws allowing animals room to move around have not shown any decline in consumption of animal products or any rise in the number of vegetarian or vegans as compared with the states like California that have. In fact, the evidence goes the other way. States like California that have these reforms where vegan and vegetarian eating is on the rise. So I just don't think there's any real case now for saying we should not move incrementally. That is, we should not do reforms that will, on the one hand, improve the lives of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of animals, and on the other hand, that we should just wait for campaigns solely for abolition without making these changes, because, in fact, we're bringing the changes closer by making those step-by-step reforms.
Yeah, and I have to say, I owe you and everyone who advocated for these animal welfare changes a big apology, because I agree with you now. But back in 2007, 2008, yeah, I mean,
you were honestly, a young radical.
I think I just hadn't thought about it enough. I was a young radical, and I think we in our last conversation I told you about some of our international interactions. I was a young radical, but I was a young radical who fancied myself open-minded and focused on evidence. And I think you're right that the evidence is pretty clear that these two things can work in hand. And I'll just give you one concrete example. When I was leafleting, I've handed out an ungodly number of leaflets to people over the years because at one point I believe leafleting was extremely effective, and it turns out it's not. So I don't leaflet anymore. But I used to leaflet extensively in Illinois, in Chicago. And I handed out, I think, tens of thousands. I handed out tens of thousands of leaflets. And it was shocking to me how little knowledge there was about factory farming in Illinois. And the moment I moved to California, it was like a night and day difference. And a big part of the reason was because of Prop 2 and Prop 12. There were so many Californians who had heard about this. The political debate about it had triggered so much awareness. And obviously, vegetarianism and veganism are much higher in California than in Illinois. So at least, I mean, you can't prove this causally as well as you'd like, because we can't do randomized controlled experiments on an entire nation or even an entire state. But if you look at the correlations, the predicted kind of demise of veganism in California absolutely didn't happen. If anything, it's the opposite. California is probably the vegan capital of the nation in terms of the number of vegans and the prominence of vegan institutions. The other thing about Prop 2 and 12 that I think from a legal perspective has been extremely valuable, that makes me think these reforms are just ladders on the rung. They're ladders on the rung towards the outcome we're trying to get at, is they really present a pretty important political and legal opportunity. Because once you have legally enforceable standards in the book, part of the reason we went from Prop 2 to 12 was because the passage of Prop 2 gave people like me the opportunity to investigate the farms and find out if they're actually complying with Prop 2. And it turned out they weren't. And if Prop 2 didn't exist, there would not have been that political infrastructure. We wouldn't have that tool in the toolkit to point out the law-breaking activity, the corruption within the industry that allows them to, frankly, just break the law left and right. And that was a tremendous opportunity that got us national media attention and triggered a lot of the reforms that led to Prop 12. So I almost see the evolution from Prop 2 in 2008 to Prop 12 in 2018 as an example of how these reforms, if done strategically, can actually facilitate just greater and greater change for the animals over the long term. But what do you think about this problem of humane washing? Like, do you think that's a serious concern? There was a piece in Vox that was written by Jessica Scott Reed, I think last year, about humane washing. We even had some dialogue about a turkey farm called Diester Turkey Ranch that was advertising itself as free range. And I think it's pretty clear now that it wasn't free range. How do you respond to people who say, yes, if these improvements were genuine, I would agree with you. It seems like there's some benefit both in the short term and the long term, but too much of it is just fraudulent. Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely concerned about that. In any large-scale human activity that is difficult to supervise, you will get some people trying to game the system to cheat. So it's going to happen. It's not going to be easy. I mean, in a way, it should get easier with ways of observing what's going on, right? You should be able to send drones over these so-called free-range farms and say, hey, where are all the turkeys out in the field? If you're producing that many turkeys, there got to be more turkeys out in the field. So, yeah, I think we need to enforce that, and fraud is a problem. But it also is a way of saying there are standards and we need to enforce them, and let's get on with enforcing them. When I was in the United States, when I was in the United Kingdom, there's a big issue going on with the RSPCA's, sort of more ethically or more humanely produced foods, and turns out that a lot of them are also not what they were said to be. And this is getting a lot of attention. Now, that kind of attention may mean that people don't go for these labels anymore, and hopefully some of them will then say, well, look, let's just avoid the animal products altogether. So that's not a bad thing if that happens. But of course, if people just say, oh, well, the labels don't mean anything, so I might as well just buy the cheapest stuff in the supermarket, then that's not a good thing. So I do think it's worth trying to build confidence in the labels by prosecuting those who are fraudulent and doing that. But we're just going to have to, that's going to be an ongoing problem, I think, and maybe it will be a problem that eventually leads more people to avoid animal products altogether.
Yeah, I've been talking to the folks who did the RSPCA investigation recently. It's a group called Animal Rising in the United Kingdom. And there are a lot of things that I've seen pushback within the animal rights movement about their investigation. I think for the most part, people are pretty supportive. But the one thing that is pretty incontrovertible about that investigation is the fact that a majority of the farms that they just randomly chose from the RSPCA's website were factory farms. And the reason they know this is because they basically went and looked into the permit requirements and found that all of them were seeking permits from the UK government for factory farms. So on the one hand, they're saying to the UK's Department of Environment, hey, we're a factory farm, we have to be regulated as such, here's our permit, blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand, they're saying to the RSPCA, we're an RSPCA assured farm, which doesn't allow for intensive confinement of animals. And so there were different things being told depending on what they felt like they had to say to the person they were talking to. And that's pretty disturbing to me. It's an interesting question whether people respond to these investigations by just giving up entirely or switching to vegetarianism and veganism. Have you seen any data on that or evidence one way or the other?
I'm not aware of data on that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because it's a big part of what I've done over the last 10 years.
Right.
So it'd be nice to know what the impacts are. But my sense is, I don't know if you've seen the data on the number of Americans, at least, who believe the animal products they're buying are coming from humane farms, but it's pretty shocking that
I know that it's wildly in excess of the number of humane farms that there are.
It's impossible. It's physically impossible. I think the statistic I've seen repeatedly, and I think this is a pretty steady number, is 75% of Americans at least believe the animal products I buy come from humane farms. And the interesting thing about that statistic is it's virtually identical to the percentage of Americans who believe that farm animal cruelty is a moral concern of theirs. So you have about 75, 80% of Americans saying, I care about farm animal cruelty. And the same percentage of people saying, I think that the products I'm buying are humane products. And it wouldn't surprise me if those two groups are more or less coextensive. You've got the same set of people saying, I care about farm animal cruelty. And guess what? Turns out all the products I'm buying are from humane farms, not factory farms. So
right, and they're believing that to avoid the cognitive dissonance of saying, yes, I think that animal farm cruelty matters, but I'm not complicit in it. And I don't know how they convince themselves of that, actually, because obviously they're just buying whatever's cheap at the supermarket. So, I don't really know.
So you've talked to, on that question, you've talked to some incredibly smart people who mostly agree with you, I think, if not entirely agree with you. People like, actually, have you talked to Steven Pinker about animal rights? What is his position? Is he a vegetarian?
Yes. So actually, I spent some time with Steven about a year ago. I think it was. We were both in Spain to receive an award from the BBVA Foundation. We jointly shared their award for research in the humanities, and so we spent a couple of days together there, and that was an experience. We talked a little bit about animals.
Well, we were just talking about cognitive dissonance avoidance and how so many Americans and people around the world who say they care about animals nonetheless continue to participate in these massive systems of violence. And that's not just kind of ordinary Americans. It's often extremely intelligent people too. I know you know a lot of these people and the names I'm thinking of are people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, who I think actually Sam is actually a vegetarian now, though, right? I think that's right.
Well, Richard says he's a vegetarian at home now. He says he makes exceptions when he goes out to eat at other people's places, but he says he's vegetarian at home. So, maybe they make progress slowly, right? we keep arguing with them, and eventually they get there.
See, but the thing about Richard Dawkins is you've already won the argument. He plugs your book. He's one of the people on the inside book cover in Operation Now, basically saying, yes, Peter's right. And so I guess the question for me is, why do you think it is that even just these extraordinarily intelligent people who agree with your argument, nonetheless can't turn around their own personal behavior to align themselves with the animal liberation movement?
Well, it's really quite a common response, I find, that people say, yes, I know you're right, but I just like my steak too much, or something of that sort. And it's this gap between their ethical views and their actions, and it shows that we're not entirely ethical creatures. I think we're not even entirely rational creatures in how we act. We don't follow the reasons that we see. But I think that's a big problem. It's probably, I don't know, my guess would be that there are more people who actually say, I agree with your arguments, but I'm not going to act on it because I like the animal products, or they're convenient, or I don't want to cause trouble to others, or something like that, than actually saying, I don't accept your arguments, and I don't think that the suffering of animals on factory farms matters, right? You said in the United States, it's 75% who do think it's a concern. So that supports this, that there's only 1/4 of Americans who think that it's not a concern. And I bet the figure would be lower in the United Kingdom and European countries. So it's a major barrier to actually getting the action we need, that people are saying that, they agree with the arguments but can't make the move. And this is one of the reasons why you might think, well, if you really had good alternative products that were just tasted like meat or like animal products, and cooked like the animal products, and had the nutrients of animal products, and were economically competitive, then we would be able to move these people. But we're certainly not in that situation yet, and it seems to be taking longer to get to that point than we had hoped it would.
Yeah. I think if you look at someone like Richard Dawkins, and you know him much better than I do, so you may be able to correct me on this. I don't think it's a taste or cost issue, because Richard Dawkins is wealthy enough. He doesn't have to worry about the cost. And
sure, it's not a cost
even in
issue.
his explanations, like publicly, I'm a huge Richard Dawkins fan. Animal Liberation is probably the most important book I've read of nonfiction. The Selfish Gene is up there too, though. It's probably in my top 5. It's just an incredible book. I think everybody should read it. It just changes the way you think about everything. And I could get into why that is, but it's a brilliant book. And so I follow his stuff a lot. And his explanation is not it's too expensive, or that, I'm just addicted to the taste. It's mostly just, it's the social norm and it's inconvenient. I just feel like I'm different. And it's so strange to me that someone who's so bold in some aspects of his life can be such a seeming coward when it comes to his diet. But it really is just social norms, it seems like. I mean, he says repeatedly, yeah, it's probably the right thing. I mean, he's expressly compared factory farming to slavery, human slavery, and said this is basically the same thing. And just as Thomas Jefferson wasn't really able to overcome the social norms of his time and give up all his slaves, I'm not able to overcome the social norms of my time and become a vegan. So, but especially for people who seemingly are as bold as Richard Dawkins or Steven Pinker. I don't know if Steven Pinker is a vegetarian, but he's made a lot of bold statements when it comes to other political and moral issues.
Yeah.
It's just striking to me how difficult it is for some of these people to make the moral jump and just be a little different when it comes to animals and animal rights.
You're right. I'm not sure what's going on, really. I mean, I had this sense with Richard, maybe it's part of, I don't know, being of a certain social group in England that is fairly conservative in its general mores, despite being bold in its opinions, and not wanting to cause fuss, when you go out for dinner with friends, some of that sort of thing. Maybe some people in England are more conservative about that. But it's strange, especially as you say, put in conjunction with the other things that he says and does.
Yeah. I have a mentor in law school. I think it's somebody but it's a professor who's now at Harvard. He used to be at the University of Chicago named Cass Sunstein. And I co-authored a paper with him on animals many years ago. And he recently wrote a piece in the New Statesman saying that his position on animal rights has been the most difficult social position he's ever taken in his life. And this is someone who's has controversial positions on capital punishment, on free speech, on democracy. I mean, he's been very bold in a lot of ways. And the hardest thing he ever did was tell people he supports animal rights. And he's not even a vegetarian. It's not like he's that radical. But just writing a book on animal rights was the scariest thing he's ever done. And it's just, I think humans are just such deeply social animals. We're so scared of being different.
And food somehow seems to be a particular area that is difficult to touch. I think that's because it's something that we do together, and we're sort of implicitly criticizing our friends if we're saying, no, I'm not going to eat what you're serving, what you eat every day. There's something that you're doing wrong. I think it goes to that, and not wanting to offend people, or not wanting to think I'm somehow more moral than you are because I'm doing this. That's also a stance that is socially unacceptable to take. I think that's I do know Cass slightly, and I hadn't known that he said that it was so difficult for him to take this stance.
Well, so far we've talked mostly about why the animal rights position is correct morally, and we talked a lot about a lot of extremely intelligent people who have endorsed the animal rights position. And in Animal Rising now, you also talk about counter arguments. And, honestly, I don't think in the first edition of Animal Rising there really were any compelling counter arguments. And I still think there really aren't any compelling counter arguments. But there at least is a philosophical opposition to animal rights now, including by people like Shelley Kagan, who actually had an interesting conversation with many years ago as well. Have you read or heard anything or discussed animal rights, if anyone, over the last 49 years who's given you pause in your philosophical convictions? Like, what are the best counter arguments that you're hearing today to the position of animal rights?
So, there are some claims that have given me pause. They're not really philosophical arguments in the sense that they're just starting from a completely different perspective that says the suffering we inflict on animals doesn't matter. I don't think there are any good arguments along those lines. But there are arguments that say, for example, well, how do we know that the life of a chicken in a factory farm, right? Let's take chickens because they're the most numerous, at least of the land-based animals. We could talk about fish, of course, even more numerous in factory farming. But let's take chickens, right? So I say, and I quote Professor John Webster, who founded the Centre for Farmed Animal Welfare at the University of Bristol and is an expert. He says that industrial chicken production for meat is the largest, most systematic, and worst form of cruelty that we inflict on animals anywhere. And that seems to me right. But how confident can we be that the lives of these chickens are so bad that they're not worth living, right? Because the counter argument here is if we stop chicken farming, these chickens simply wouldn't exist. And therefore, if their lives are positive even by a tiny amount, the moral argument for abolishing industrial chicken production goes away. It isn't there, at least from my view. There's arguments that can say, well, even if their lives are positive, if they're still bad compared with free range chickens, we shouldn't have them. But it's not so clear anyway. You get into that more difficult issue of bringing beings into existence who will have good lives. So the question is, how confident can we be that their lives are actually miserable? Now, there's lots of evidence that many of them suffer acutely because, for example, because they are bred to grow so fast, they put on weight extremely quickly. Their immature leg bones can't really support their weight, at least for the last couple of weeks of their life. Sometimes their legs collapse under them. There's no individual attention paid, so they will simply starve to death or die of thirst if they can't get to food or water because their legs have collapsed. So that's a horrible death, and the life of that chicken is a horrible life on balance. And let's say this happens to about 5% of the chickens reared. Okay, so 5% of the chickens have horrible lives. The other 95% certainly don't have good lives because they are very crowded. They're stressed from the crowding. Eventually, they get thrown into crates and trucked to slaughter. The slaughter process is not necessarily a humane one. Again, a certain percentage have their throats cut while they're fully conscious rather than being pre-stunned. But they are getting food. They're not being predated upon. So I'm, that's something that has given me pause to say, what's the basis of my confidence that their lives are on balance miserable? And without that, can I really continue to argue that this is a vast evil on a huge scale? So, those questions still puzzle me a little bit.
Isn't the reg counterfactual for the experience of chickens suffering on factory farms, though? Not non-existence, but giving them a better existence, right? So, especially as a utilitarian, the question isn't kind of what would happen if we didn't do this to animals. It's the full opportunity set. What are all the possibilities out there? And a world where we gave every chicken, I mean, I think there's an argument we should have plenty more non-human animals and we should be giving them good lives because it's just a lot cheaper and easier to give them good lives and make them extremely happy. Think about dogs and how easy it is to make a dog happy relative to human child, right? It's like,
right. But I didn't understand why you said it's cheaper and easier.
So I guess the question is,
easier to make chicken lives better. It's more expensive. That's why it isn't
I think it's cheaper and easier to live a chicken life better than a dog or a human, probably, in terms of total social resources.
Oh, yes. But but people are
So
going
in
to
other
have
words,
to pay
what
more,
we should
more
do
for their
is
chicken.
if anyone were to suffer, it would be us. Like, let's use less resources on ourselves and give chickens a paradise life because you can have billions and billions of very happy chickens at very low cost. And let's let the humans suffer if anyone's going to suffer, right? If you're going to take an anti-species perspective, wouldn't that be the right alternative?
If the cost of chicken is going to double or triple, there are going to be fewer chickens, right? People are not going to have the financial resources to support the same number of chickens, and it would take a vast amount of farmland to have that many chickens leading good lives outside. So realistically, I don't think that's going to happen. You are going to get many fewer chickens
in general. Yeah.
So that's why I think the comparison is non-existence.
Yeah, this weird kind of moral dilemma that's triggered by total utilitarianism, where you're just aggregating all the welfare of all the living beings versus average utilitarianism. I don't even know how to get my hands around that question, and maybe you do, but it's a struggle for me. And I think that the general answer I come to is,
sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say that's well-known and difficult philosophical question whether we should
For
take
sure.
a total view
Hmm.
of well-being. I think it's pretty clear that we should not take an average view. The average view has many paradoxes when you try and work that out. For
Yeah.
example, you could raise the average well-being of humans by sort of preventing the lives of humans who will live below
Yep.
average lives, even though those lives might be quite positive, right? If you have a community with most people very happy and you prevent those bringing children into the world who will still be happy but not very happy, that will raise the average. But that doesn't seem
Hmm.
to be the right thing to do. So, people look at all sorts of other views, what they call person affecting views, which means that you only get to count once you're in existence. Um,
Hmm.
uh, but even there, it's not clear that that view is going to help chickens. Really, I don't know. So I think there's a deep philosophical question there that we the fullest formulation of we owe to Derek Parfit, the Oxford philosopher who died about 6 years ago, and he was never
Hmm.
able to solve the problem in his lifetime. There are many other very good philosophers working on this issue who have also not solved it. So I think that's a difficult question, and that's why I think trying to see whether the lives of chickens are actually negative is quite important for making the argument. Um, I think you can argue that they're negative. I mean, just to go back to what I was saying before, even if it's only 5% who have really terrible deaths and suffer greatly, uh, if the other 95% also have, because of the overcrowding and because of the strain on their legs and so on, have lives that are just possibly positive, but quite possibly negative. I think we can say that the overall mix is likely to be negative because we give a lot of weight to the uh, suffering and death of the 5% who don't actually make it, even though they're very young birds, they don't make it through. Uh, plus, of course, there are environmental arguments about how wasteful this is about food. So I think you can still make a strong case against industrial farming of chickens. But if you're asking me as to what are the objections that have given me pause, um,
Pause. Yeah.
they're those kinds of objections about how much we can really know about the mental states of non-human animals.
Yeah, and just so the audience understands, that 5% figure is not an arbitrary number. It actually is that severe. The number of animals that end up, especially in chicken farms, with motility issues, mobility issues. I mean, just from the things I personally witnessed anecdotally, 5 to 10% of the animals seem to be experiencing some sort of lameness that prevents them from reaching food and water. The mortality rate of chickens over a 6 week period is often 10, 15% in that very short 6 week period before they're slaughtered. And there's been evidence from commercial agriculture research showing that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 chickens is lame by the time they reach slaughter, or is at least experiencing significant gait issues. And that means they're going to struggle. Every time they're trying to get to
Yeah,
food and water, they have to fight through a huge crowd to get to food and water. So 5%
yeah.
might
There's
actually
a
be an
lot.
underestimate.
Well, it might. I think those were Department of Agriculture figures that I took from.
Hmm.
That they're in animal liberation now. I looked at that issue of the percentage that don't make it, and I have some
Negative,
discussion
yeah.
of that. So maybe it's a somewhat conservative figure, but it's yes,
Yeah.
it's definitely not. It's not just a plucked out of the air. Certainly
Yep.
it's that or more.
More. Yeah. Yeah. So we haven't, before we end the conversation, we haven't talked about the other kind of foundational. Oh, I don't know if you would describe it as the two foundational pieces that you've worked on, but from my perspective, as someone who's read your work for now a couple of decades, the other foundational work I associate with you is Famine, Affluence, and Morality, and the effective altruism movement. So I guess just to start off, can you describe what you see as the key insight from that paper that people practically should try to apply to their day to day lives?
Well, the key insight is simply that um, we live in a world in which there are many of us who live very comfortably. Excuse me. Many of us who live very comfortably and have money to spare, that we don't do anything really that's essential for us to do. That's not goes beyond meeting our basic needs. They're luxuries or frivolities that we spend money on, and at the same time, there are when I wrote it, it was a larger proportion, but we now have something less than 10% of the population, but still who are living in extreme poverty, as judged by the World Bank. That means roughly, I think now, $2.15 per day, and they there are many consequences of that. Their children die at a much higher rate from preventable causes like malaria or diarrhea. And there are other people who are having conditions that we would immediately get fixed, like they're blind because they have cataracts as they get older, or they're blind because they've developed trachoma, which is the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world. They're young women who have obstetric difficulties when they're giving birth, and as a result of that, they're permanently incontinent, but that can be repaired by surgery. So there are many things that we can do to help people in extreme poverty at very little cost to ourselves. When I say very little cost, I mean, it doesn't make our lives worse. In fact, I'd argue that it makes our lives better because we're doing something meaningful and fulfilling. And there are effective organizations that can take our donation and do that. And so that seems to me to be something that people with resources to spare ought to be doing. We need to expand our sense of what it is to live an ethical life to include, in a world like this, doing something to help people who are much less fortunate than we are, where at minimal sacrifice or no sacrifice by our own part, we can make a really important difference to their lives.
So there are not many people who can claim to have triggered two political movements, but this paper sat around for decades, and I think it influenced a lot of people, and a lot of people read it. It was published in a top philosophy journal, Philosophy and Public Affairs. But in 2013, you gave a TED Talk, and actually, my cousin is one of the people featured in the TED Talk because she earns to give at Google. Ada
Right.
Wong.
Okay.
But did you ever think this paper would turn into a political movement? And the political movement, you can roughly describe it as effective altruism, but I think you've had an influence on people ranging from Bill Gates and Warren Buffett to the average tech worker in the Bay Area. I think there's a shocking number of people who are at least familiar with the concepts that you first published. I guess this is a paper it was before Animal Liberation, so I'm guessing 1971, 72, something like that.
72 it appeared, yeah.
Okay. Did you think this paper was going to turn into a political movement? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on effective altruism at this point, especially in light of all the controversy that's existed in the movement over the last couple of years.
Yeah, did I think it would turn into a political movement? Probably not really. You don't really expect papers you publish in philosophy journals to turn into political movements. But,
fair point.
Yeah, but it was published at a time when there were a lot of radical ideas around in the early 70s and new movements formed. So maybe I had some hope that it would catch on. It took a long time to catch on. It caught on basically not because everybody read it in the journal, but because it got anthologized in a lot of anthologies that are used as textbooks in philosophy classes. So introductory to ethics classes have these collections of essays. And as gradually people started putting more essays of a practical ethical nature into the anthologies, remember I said at the beginning of this talk that when I was an undergraduate, philosophy was in this linguistic analysis mode where most of the articles published about ethics were about analyzing moral concepts and didn't have any normative implications, were really rather boring. But gradually that changed. Practical ethics started to become an important area of ethics. Students liked it, so departments had to teach it because departments wanted to attract students, obviously. So gradually it got read by a lot of people, and I think out of that, at least 30 years later, some of those students started to say, "Hey, this idea is really right, and it's not just a theoretical idea, but we ought to be doing something about it." So people like Toby Ord and Will MacAskill in Oxford, I think, were among the first when they were graduate students. Particularly Toby started this organization called Giving What We Can, which put forward the idea that we can give and we should give as effectively as possible. And I didn't emphasize the effectiveness in my original article. So, if you're saying I somehow triggered this movement, it took something else as well, and that's the emphasis on giving effectively and on research, drawing on research that shows which charities are effective, which is something that I've certainly taken up. Toby took up with Giving What We Can, and I've taken up with an organization called The Life You Can Save that I co-founded, which curates a list of about 20 really effective organizations that you can give to with confidence that they will use your money in a highly effective manner.
Yeah, I think from what I recall, I think maybe your TED Talk doesn't talk as much about the effective giving part, but it's very much implicit in your argument, because your argument is about optimization. It's, don't just give because your local church happens to be the institution that is going to give you the most social cred for giving to them, because you want to put your name on a university building. So you give to Princeton or Stanford or Australian National University. Give where it's going to have the most impact. And part of that implicitly is looking at the evidence to figure out what is going to have the most impact. Is it putting my name on a building at Stanford?
Definitely. But by
So
the
it
TED
seemed
Talk,
like very implicit.
I was already in touch with Will and Ord,
I
and I
see.
was by the time of the TED Talk, I was certainly talking about effectiveness, but that's not in the 1972
Yeah.
article. So by then, I influenced them, and then they influenced me.
Yep. Are you still in touch with Will and Toby a lot nowadays? Or do
Absolutely.
you still...
I saw them both. I was in Oxford like 3 weeks ago, and I saw them both then.
Yeah. I wonder if you think kind of this excessive focus on optimization, I mean, I use the term excessive, but maybe it's not excessive, is part of the reason kind of for what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried. And I have a very different view of him than most people. I actually don't think he was a bad actor. I personally knew him, and I thought I disagree with him on most of the things he was trying to do with effective altruism and with animal rights, but I thought he was a good actor. I just thought he was a little bit too much of a computer scientist. His head was in the sky, and he was optimizing in ways that were detached from reality, and it led him down a path to disaster, not just for him, but for thousands of the people invested in FTX. So I just wonder, do you think that has been taken too far? Is that part of the reason we had people like Sam Bankman-Fried?
I don't really think that's got much to do with Sam Bankman-Fried. I'm somewhat in agreement with your view of him. I don't know if you've read Michael Lewis's book, Going Infinite. Michael Lewis was sort of, before everything went bad, he was already doing a book on Sam Bankman-Fried, and so he was there on the inside. And his view is that essentially he was incompetent rather than fraudulent. That he and others in the company did not know to the nearest, I think, $8 billion, the size of the assets that the company owned, which is quite an amazing figure when you think of it, if that's right. And they had thought that there was money in two places when there was only money in one place. I don't know, but I think that the emphasis on getting the best value out of your resources that you're doing to make the world a better place is perfectly sound. To what extent you need to say, we need to have like randomized controlled trials, and without that, we can't know what's worth doing and what's not. That may be a little bit excessive. And the emphasis on long-term things where, we're talking about the next million years, and we need to reduce the risk of extinction because of the incredible value of all of those lives that will be lived if we don't become extinct. That may get into very speculative stuff that I think is a distraction from the things that we can know with confidence we ought to be doing here and now. But, those are complex debates, and people can reasonably have different views in them. So I'm still generally in favor of the idea that evidence-based giving is and evidence-based volunteering or working is what we should be doing.
Yeah, I think that to me, the possible connection, and I don't know if this is true, and maybe no one will know, because who knows what the psychology of one person is. I mean, oftentimes even that person doesn't know what's driving them psychologically. We're, as Buddhist masters have said for thousands of years, the hardest problem in the universe might be just to know thyself. But to me, the connection between what happened with FTX and some of the ideas in effective altruism is that one of the reasons I think Sam and the team there did not think about the risks they were taking, were not so focused on things like compliance and accounting, was because they were optimizing. and they thought, this other trivial stuff doesn't matter. What we need to focus on is maximizing the amount of dollars we can create. And if we miss out on a little thing called compliance, I mean, that's what kind of the dumb people do who aren't optimizing. And I'm going to optimize by focusing on the high value things I need to focus on, which is the opportunities presented itself by the crypto market. And so things like compliance, accounting, those things don't matter. And it's very similar to kind of the long-termist thinking, where a lot of the long-termists and long-termism is just a philosophy. We should be really thinking about the long term, maybe even more so than the present lived reality of human beings who are suffering. Because if you think about the potentially trillions upon trillions or quadrillions of human beings and sentient beings that could live for the next 1,000 years or the next 100,000 years, why are we thinking about people who are suffering today? Long-termists, in many ways, see the suffering of people today, often, in my experience, as that inconvenient logistical detail that we don't have to worry about, because the big number that we should be concerned about is the quadrillions in the future. And they don't see the connection between the logistical question of how do we reduce suffering today and the fate of the future, in the same way that I think Sam didn't quite see the connection between the logistical realities of trying to do your compliance in a reasonable way and earning the money he needed to earn over the long term to give as much as he possibly could to the poor and the needy, including animals. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. I just think one of the critiques of effective altruism that I think probably should be addressed by people within the community is just making sure our heads aren't in the clouds in these kind of thought experiments, like connecting ourselves very much with the reality of the world around us in the present day. But I could be wrong.
Yep.
Did you?
I'm all in favor of keeping in touch with the reality.
Did you ever
in the
meet
world.
Sam?
Once, yes. I once had dinner with
What'd
him.
you think of him? Did you think he was a good player? Because it's hard to make a read on someone in one day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say from that one meeting. I don't know. Look, unfortunately,
I'm
going to have to go because we've been going an hour and a half, and I didn't know we were doing that long. So
okay, no
we'll
worries
have
at all.
to wind up.
Let me ask you one last question then. What is the most important thing you've learned over the last 40 years in all the advocacy and thinking you've done?
So I think the most important thing.
I'll throw a couple out if there's not just one.
Yeah, like, learning about having evidence for what you're doing, that it's making a positive difference, is really important. But also, I think being open about what you're doing, being as reasonably transparent as you can about what you're doing, assuming the good in people, that there's something good to work with, that you can work with almost anybody. Obviously, there's a point where you will say, no, I can't work with that person, but you can go a long way with assuming that people are good and are willing to make progress. A lot of that, some of the stuff I learned from Henry Spira, who was a very effective activist in the last quarter of the 20th century, and I wrote a book about Henry called Ethics into Action, which is still around, and his approach of, even if you're dealing with corporate heads of organizations that are doing bad things to animals, it's best to assume that if they know about what they're doing and they can find a way to stop doing what they're doing without turning the company upside down or making it go into bankruptcy, that they will be willing to try to do that. And so you should meet them with that sort of positive cooperative assumption, and only abandon that and go antagonistic when you really feel that you've tried it and you can't get anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson, not just for animals and animal rights, but for the world. In a world where there's so much conflict and hate.
Yeah.
Assuming good faith really can change the world. Well, thank you so much for the time, Peter. I really appreciate it. Where can people follow you? I know you have a Substack out. Can you plug whatever social media or other platforms you're currently using that people can find you on?
Sure, you can follow me on X, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Substack, as you said. Also, I now have a podcast called Lives Well Lived that I'm doing with a Polish philosopher, Kasia de Lazari-Radek. And you can go and look at my website, which is petersinger.info.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. Until next time.
Thanks, Wayne. It's been good to be with you.
Okay, bye-bye. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them.
And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.